Okay, we're going to take another journey here in sacred geometry. I know we haven't done it in a while, but I feel like some things like this have to really be digested over time, and you get an understanding of it, even go over it again and again. It helps me to go over it again and again. This is a weird thing that's going to show you the story of creation written out of sacred geometry. It's done in a video format from after school, which has a lot of interesting articles, and once they introduced this storyboard format, I think it really did a lot for us. Here we're looking at the supposed coming up from monkeys to an ape-man kind of thing, to a Homo erectus Neanderthal type, to a modern human, and the modern human started asking questions. Well, in reality, they were asking questions all the time, and it's taken quite some time to get there. Strangely, you look around his feet that are right here and you actually see some mushrooms. That's another concept that I'll have to get in another ideal of talking about this type of thing. But in this point where we started trying to figure out where we all came from, we came up with a lot of different ideas. In fact, we came up with this idea through the religion that we all currently know, that the earth was only a few thousand years old somehow. And people believed this stuff for a long time. But then through looking around more, we realized that some of these things that we used to call griffins are actually triceratops, and whenever we thought of dragons and all that came up, I still wholeheartedly believe that that came from people finding ancient fossils and trying to make a remnant of it. Just like the idea of a great flood got expounded because people saw that there were fossils of known fish invertebrates in rocks that were up in the Himalayas, and couldn't fathom the idea that that used to be under the ocean and all got pushed up. That the Earth's been through a lot of changes, physical changes, and right now we're really in a fruition time and being able to accelerate humanity to the point that we are today, where we can really step outside of ourselves and start looking at how this truly, really happened. Because shortly after this, there were scientists that were figuring out that no, this is millions of years older, and there's layers laid down, and in those layers you slowly lose a lot of these creatures that are in it. It came up with a concept of it, and everybody knows about Darwin's theories and things, but then we ended up having an idea that the world is somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. Some say it's 4.32 billion years old, and that would go with sacred geometry. But that was really when we were looking at the Earth and how the Earth was. And during about this time, whenever religion was totally shattered with the idea that we all came from around 4000 BC and popped up like popcorn because a magic sky god had done things, and a woman grew from a rib because a wise talking snake told her to eat from a tree after she grew from a rib. You know, it's a strange story. But whenever you have talking snakes or talking donkeys and things in stories, you realize it's all mythology. But again, I've tried to search for the truth that's in mythology, and there's a lot of it in there. So a lot of this comes from preemptive to the idea of the religion that we have today, and a lot of these elder religions went back much, much farther in their concepts. They didn't think the world was that old, that we think of it today as being only 4,000 with the lineages that were written in the Bible. That's where that comes from. Even though they're using extremely elongated, exaggerated lifetimes, which I've said before, if you took and divided that by 13, i.e. the amount of moons that there are in a year, you'll get a more accurate representation of maybe how long these people lived versus their exaggerated state that's spoken of in the Bible. Irregardless of that fact, we know that that's not true now. In fact, we're many levels past the point that we know that that's not true anymore. And to a lot of people, that shatters them in some way, but it really shouldn't, because it was a priest that came up with the Big Bang Theory. This was where you got an idea that everything all came from one point, that everything in the whole universe, which at this time we hadn't really learned totally about. We knew our solar system and there was other stuff out there and so on, and we were just burgeoning on this. And so this idea of this Big Bang Theory came out from a priest, Lemaitre, George Lemaitre. But then shortly after that, we found out that Evan Hubble figured out that due to the red shift and the Doppler effect of these distant galaxies going away from us, they were showing a slightly skewed point, and that was leading him to believe that we were exploding outwards and that everything was getting farther and farther away from us right now. In fact, there's this extreme belief that if this would have happened a few 100 million years later, a lot of the galaxies that we're talking about finding now with the new JST telescope and so on, or James Webb, that they wouldn't even be there. In fact, we're watching them race out of our vision at this point. And then they figured out, well, it's not 4.5 billion years ago, but about 13.8 billion years ago. So then the idea of where did the Big Bang come from and what happened before that, that would have to be the question. I mean, inquiring minds want to know, just like C3PO wants to know, well, what became before that? It's the idea of what became before the chicken and the egg and so on. And so we had this idea in the Bible, which may be somewhat true, but you have to twist it totally and then take away that lineage mistake that's been pushed on us for so many times. And then you'll find some pagan roots to the idea of how sacred geometry fits into all of this, and timing and so on. And that people back in the day used to know a whole lot more than we ever give them credit for in a modern day. In fact, they knew so much more. It's incredible as you look into it. And it's all been written off long ago because of a belief that was in the Bible that the world was only 4,000 years old, so we can't look at anything other than that. And so anything other than that has to be, oh, it's Satan fooling us or something silly along that line, because this idea that we came up with has to be true. Whether you see inside sacred geometry a flower of life, or you can see the ankh right here at the top of it, or perhaps how DNA helixes work, or even how atoms work or even came to be. All of these geometrical shapes here are things that I remember seeing from old spirographs. This is something in the 60s that kids would get, and there was a board and a plate, and you put a piece of paper into it, and then you used different circles that had different points you could stick a pin in it. And as you swung it around, and it made weird shapes because it's oblong in that idea, and it tic-tac, 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 tic-tac goes around. And oddly, even though you've got a circle and a circle thing here, you can actually make something that looks just like a hexagon, or something that looks like a flower quite often whenever you see things like this. But also you'll end up seeing sacred geometry, because that's the kind of ideas that it was built upon, and that's where that old toy for kids of a spirograph actually came from. Some of these are having to do with the shapes of planets and so on. But so then we have this idea that everything all came from one point, and each of us in ourselves all came from a point, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this point of the Big Bang idea is kind of thrown off, and even just like most everything else, once we get deeper into it, you find that there's a whole lot of layers to that onion. I did a video about a year ago describing how that when everything came all together, like it's showing you in this single point that was going on, that it never even really got to that point. You can imagine how much gravity affects time and so on that we've talked about, or that you've learned about. whenever you even start to get near a black hole, right? Imagine 200 billion black holes closing in on themselves. Before they ever get to this point, it starts exploding. And so it never really got to this point right here. But another strange effect that's brought about by the philosophy of these thoughts is that whenever it was closing in on itself and fixing to explode, that time took literally forever. If anything, a god or whatever you want to try to call it, or just somebody in a spaceship was out here hovering out, watching it fixing to go off, it would have taken forever. For something to have moved an inch would have taken 100,000 years, or 1,000,000 or more. It's an incredible thing to think about, though, but as it tried to close in on itself, and some of the stuff was still somewhat far away, it all tried to explode. But just like somebody who's a couple of footballs of fields away from a nuclear explosion, that doesn't mean that you're safe. And so everything got fried somewhat and exploded back out. And that's where we come from today, in this idea of this one point in time. But we can take that one point that we see there and look at it as being oneself. Just to put yourself in the idea, like, oh, I'm an atom now, or I'm that singularity concept, that it only knows of a certain range that's around it. And because everything's null and void, like it said in the Bible, there was no form of it, we only know about that spot. And the ancient Egyptians had this concept, and you can find it in a lot of other religions too, from Chinese and Taoism to actual ancient people of India, ancient Anatolia, the Druids, the ancient Egyptians. And this is one thing that I've tried to show over and over again, that these people had a commonality to them that people don't want to give credit for. They want to separate everybody like they never even saw each other, or that the Silk Road and contact was made then and not thousands and thousands of years before. Or to even look at primordial man starting and realize that some of this interactions had happened long, long ago. The Egyptians had this concept. Well, they had a different idea for creation for almost every gnome that they had there in it, but the concept that they show off in here of creation is indicative of this sacred geometry. And this sacred geometry we talk about is shown in ancient Egypt. It's shown in ancient Sumeria, and it's kind of a secret, to the point that they don't put it everywhere. In fact, it's remarkable that you can go into Osiris's temple and still see it today, where they put it right up on the wall there. And there's probably a reason that they had that. But let's look at what the Bible says. It says in the King James Version that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's the whole universe. And we know that's what happened first. And the earth was without form and null and void. Now we get down to, instead of 13.8 billion years ago, we're only at about 4.3 or 4.5 billion years ago, if you will. But imagine this idea too. We're only able to see car headlights so far away. And we're pulling out telescopes now, like JST, the James Webb telescope, and we had Hubble before that, and so on. And each of these has been a step for us realizing more. And what we're realizing is stuff is stepping out of our ability to have any vision on it anymore. And things are accelerating whenever they do so, to a point that they really just fade off. And we never knew that they existed. So is the universe that we're in 13.8 billion years ago, or is that just the difference of what we can see? Because they just found out from James Webb telescope here that they found some of the earliest known galaxies that they've ever seen in all of the universe. And they're about the dating that's shown there at 13.8. But the problem ensues is that they're already formed. And so I've even seen a video recently where they go Big Bang dating thrown out the door, because this really couldn't have formed inside the first 500,000 years to the point that it's a well understood galaxy that's formed that looks just like our Milky Way pretty much, or Andromeda, our twins. So this shows you that no, that's not true. Things are just going out of our range of vision that we can even look at. And so while we can get close to 14 billion years looking back, how old is it? Is it 15, 18, 25, 40? It could go forever. Just like that concept of right, whenever it was fixing to come together and explode, that moment took literally forever. Something that you could have sat and watched your watch on it and go, okay, about now, no. Each little step in that of less than an inch was taking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to even accomplish, from somebody who would have a watch sitting out in the third person point of view, far enough away to watching this happen, but not close enough to be just sucked in and spaghettified, if you follow me. But the earth was without form and null and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. This is a sexual connotation. It's just kind of an elusive type thing or whatever, or innuendo, if you will. But also, whenever they tell you the world was without form, null and void, as it says in the earlier Bibles, those words are tohu and bohu, and they actually mean that it was Tiamat and Bahamut, which are giant dragons that are talked about in ancient Sumerian. It's where they stole that idea from to put into there too, because they saw the realism of how our planet perhaps came to form. And you think that that's something in a modern day where we came up with, how did we get the moon, or how did we get this, and how did we get that? But they had whole ideas of that. Kingu was killed in the idea, and his head was cut off, and he forever faced upon Kia. Well, Kia is the earth, Gaia, or Kia is the earth, Mother Earth, if you will, and he's forever looking upon her. This is the man in the moon. And his blood, so the blood of God's, along with clay and this, that, and the other, ended up making an anamorphic type creature that turned into us. That was the idea. Like they did some magic that you think of as Zeus, where they had little chess pieces and pawns and playing it out in some way, and that they allude to something like this. There's a couple of other allusions and other Genesis type stories that go on there, but in that fact, whenever we get to the point of this in the story here, we're already looking at, it's not quite like the ancient Babylonians or Sumerians said. It's a little different. God said, let there be light. And we know that what kicked off our solar system was our sun, and that drew everything in or blew it away, and it's the reason we have the Oort cloud out past us and so on. That solar wind is blowing out to there, keeping that from getting sucked in, regardless of some things do every now and then. And you'll find that the ancients kind of knew all of this, but that got taken out of thoughts and stuff and thought that it was all pagan. There was times whenever certain people, like the Muslim people, thought that numbers were evil, and so they just quit studying it whenever they had it going on pretty good there for a little while, and then they just dropped it. In fact, we did the same thing in Northern Europe with the idea of the Dark Ages and concepts like that, and luckily we were able to come out of it to what we know today. So whenever you have this null and void situation, there's nowhere to go. You can spin around, you can do whatever, and there's nowhere to go. But what you do is you take and go to the edge of what you can see, and whenever you do, it forms two circles that are crisscross, or what we call a vesica Pisces. Now this football in the middle of it is a lot of things. It is the feminine form. We probably played games when we were a kid talking about it and so on, but you know what I'm talking about. but it's also the lens of our eye that we see the world in. So once you get to this point here at the edge of it, then you form a new boundary, and around the edge you make forms. Well, you have to do this using sacred geometry, crisscross from each other and so on. But if you get to this side point area here and you make another circle, this is ironically, like I told you, it's an old rock and roll albums and stuff I saw when I was a kid. In fact, when I figured it out and then I looked around my room and thought that we were all surrounded by it, I realized, oh my God, we're way surrounded by it. For this used to be on the drum kit of Led Zeppelin. Turned a different way, but it's the same idea. And if we take and put another one on and another one on, well, what we're going through is the days of creation in this concept I'm trying to show you. 1, 2, 3. And then once we do this, we're stepping over that boundary on the 4th day, that 5th day, and that 6th day. And this is called the seed of life. If you look at it, it's got a flower in the center of it. A lot of things can be garnered from this, and you can use different points and end up figuring out the trajectory of the way that Venus moves in the night sky, and that ends up being the magic of a pentagram, which is a feminine essence, looked at as being with witches and all these things that go on to it, and sure enough, Venus is. We programmed it that way in there. People to this day think of that on this idea, and you know, men are for Mars, women are for Venus. But if we take this to another level and we start putting more bubbles around it that are attached in the same way to the next section that's on here, we get this. Now, this is the egg of life. And within the egg of life, there's a bunch of ideas. But you and I, and everything that has a living form, has an egg of life that started it all off and it started splitting. I think you can easily see that directly in this concept of sacred geometry. Now, I'm not telling you they had microscopes in ancient Sumer or anything like that silly. I'm telling you that their insight to these concepts that are bigger than themselves and smaller than themselves, and looking at everything, made a rational idea of the way that atoms work, molecules, the way that life even happens, for they call it the seed, the egg of life, and so on here. And they had an idea that if you look at it, that was a whole lot closer than some magic man with a city in the clouds that made it happen. In fact, the only thing that'll make that part of the mythology come to true is that we actually find out that space aliens had hands in this, because you see, the God of the Bible is not from Earth. In fact, due to its own definition, the way he created it, he's not from here. Therefore, he's legally an alien to this planet. Whoops. But let's get back into this concept here, because it not only happens with us in life and so on too, but it actually happens to that piece of wood that you're looking at over here, our plastics, our metal, and so on. And it uses sacred geometry shapes that end up forming its strength or its variability or its ability to mix with things or not want to, and so on like that. And so we get this symbol here that if we wrap around one more, we get that flower of life. Now, this is the exact same description or depiction that is shown in ancient Egypt on the wall right there in the Osiris temple. But we can find this everywhere that these ancient people used to do. And don't get me caught up calling them Aryans whenever this predates the time of Aries or sons of Aries or anything that goes along with that concept for a long time. And you can see that as people came into civilization, just like the swastika, this symbol was found in ancient China, in ancient Ireland, in ancient India, in ancient Egypt, and in Sumer. And everywhere that Mary went, that lamb was sure to go. Well, it's not the lamb of Aries. That was just a period in time where major things were happening, and people made attachments to that and the concept and what the name actually means. But this was going on long before this, as I've stated and shown many times. But you can see here repeated flowers of life done everywhere. Here's a dragon holding on to a ball like the earth, and that ball is like, well, it's not able to be shown here very easily, This ball that's shown in the bottom right-hand corner is like an egg, like a dragon egg, if you will, and it's showing this concept. The same thing you see in bottom, middle, and so on. So it's something that's definitely caught up in it. And this is, again, a series that I'm going to try to put out here because I feel like you can take another layer of that onion, and I'm going to show you the same stuff again with more, giving you that layer of the onion effect and more to consume again. We'll go on and on with it. But this has been found in many ancient places. And so this concept of Adam and Eve and so on like that, that doesn't really fall into the truth of things, but there was a point when man became sentient. And it's believed these one magic people were started off by some gods, and it was their way to rationalize how they were so much more advanced than the animals or any other people that they ran into somehow. It's written in there, and if you took it apart, everybody would say it's racist now and everything, but look, it's the religion of a people that lived in a certain area. It's not the religion of other people who have adopted it now and finally found out later and want to interject themselves, which the book says not to do, by the way. And I could go off in left field and start talking about serpent worship and all kinds of things that come from this idea, but we can see here with this concepts going on, it's led us into our modern day. And this is one of the major things that withheld the information, but also it showed the information. This actually works with the size of everything. It works within our human bodies to a way that we have sacred proportions. That an inch is based on a human thumb. And that the foot isn't the size of the foot, but 12 sacred inches. Then we go with man's stride, and you'll find that a double stride, like left, right, comes out to 5.28 feet. And then that was used in sacred geometry to build oh so many buildings in the ancient of days. But it's right there in the pyramid. It's right there in the Parthenon. It's right there in all these ancient cathedrals all across Europe and England and so on. Sacred geometry and architecture. Taj Mahal, so many places. If we take this flower and one more step, it becomes the fruit of life, and there are key points on that fruit of life. And so the flower of life gives forth a fruit. And that fruit has a shape here that is found in nuclear elements and so on, people. Something that we agree on this idea, but if we take that feminine shape, which is all rounded off and smooth, and put male shapes over the top of it, of sacred geometry, of triangles and hexagrams, and put it all together, we end up having a Jewish star in the middle of this thing, and where these sacred things come from, and we start to develop pictures of platonic solids of all these different shapes that are pretty much like Dungeons and Dragons dice, which give you percentage chances of certain things. Now, this is taken from Egypt, but it's the Greeks that are credited with taking this to the next step and showing it off so that someone could see it. Plato even talked about how geometry will draw the soul towards the truth and create the spirit of philosophy. Well, most people don't know that philosophy really just means the love of wisdom. Philosophia. Sophia was the god of wisdom. So in this is created a cube and a tetrahedron, which is actually kind of like the pyramid, and an octahedron, which is doubled pyramids put on the bottom and top of each other, or an icosahedron, which is the 20-sided dice that you use in Dungeons and Dragons, or the dodecahedron, which is also pretty important. For the dodecahedron is what the ancients said was what the universe was made out of. And strangely, whenever you look through this idea, the cube is for the earth. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because the earth's not just some square thing that you fall off of the edge of, even though people try to get people to believe that. Well, no, you can square the circle, And believe it or not, it has the exact same amount of angle to it and so on too. That's why whenever they try to say that the ark was a square type of thing, when you look at the actual description of it, it said it was round. That doesn't make any sense. Well, yeah, it does, because the people that came up with the story and what the shape of the ark was supposed to be and the measurements were using coracles. Strangely, you'll find coracles in ancient Ireland and so on, and you find them in ancient Sumer too. You might find them in a few other places, but there are connections between Ireland and Sumer that actually go much deeper than just saying, well, they both had round boats. Tetrahedron is the fire, and this is the pyramid. In fact, pyro means fire, and mid means the middle of it, in the center of the fire, the hot point. Or if you take two of those and go away, then you get air. So you get earth, wind, and fire there. Well, also water is shown by the 20-sided dice that's shown here as the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron is the ether of space, which makes sense with the cosmic idea we were talking about before. So all this is together with each other, and you can see these forms that are shown here in the star tetrahedron. It's a star caressed or caveated into another star, or a diamond shape or a pyramid, is the Star of David idea. And Metatron's cube takes it to another level, but if you'll look at the center of it, it has the Star of David inside of that. But the hexahedron is there too with the giant hex, but then again, like when you look at a soccer ball, don't we have interconnected triangles making that happen? Or the octahedron that's shown here, or the dodec, and showing you that there are shapes even that make this up. They have to all be enclosing or it doesn't work. Just like an atom, just like the biggest things or the smallest things, it doesn't work unless it connects like this. And you can find that the shapes are the simplest of geometric shapes, with a pentagram, a triangle, a square, and so on. It also makes all the shapes of the periodic elements, and we use that in chemistry today. In fact, that's what led us to the ideal of how chemistry works, how things connect to each other, how you form molecules, how you can take this essence and that essence and put together and get a third thing out of it with a remainder. It's quite amazing. So this concept envelops so much many more things than just space and time, which in itself is like an EMC square concept that we've had forever. And you can find it in the depictions of the way atoms are. You can find it in the swirls of sound, and put sound on a plate in sand, and due to certain frequencies, they put out these shapes. And you can take this shape idea all the way through what's known of just about everything, even the planets that are shown here, with Venus being in the center of it, and it does look kind of like a familiar flower right here in the middle. But then again, if we made that with points, that's that pentagram, that's that five-sided star. It takes 8 years for Venus to trek this in the sky, but these astronomer people were looking at these things, figuring out how it all works, and because they were using reality, geometry, math, which is a super language that's no different. If we can get to talking to each other about 1, 2, 10, 100, 1,000 and how these things work, you can talk with anybody about math, even though you probably couldn't speak to them on a regular basis. But this happens everywhere, in honeycombs and so on, that are shown with the hex that's there. And so this has brought us all the way from the time of the pyramids and Stonehenge and things to a modern time that's done now. And sadly, we see it fading away where people aren't paying attention to it anymore. But the old adage of as above, so below also fits in this idea, because this concept of a seed or an egg of life makes you out of something that's so small in the tip of a pinhead, and you can grow to this point. But once we grow up, there are as many things smaller than us, going all the way back to our own creation and creation itself, to as many things that are much bigger than us. And you can think of this as being animals and elephants and things, but there's also little bitty things. Once you run out of animals and you start picking other things, you'll find that it goes all the way down to atoms and the things that make up atoms. And it goes all the way up big to a solar system and a galaxy and the molecules that make up our universe. It's an incredible thought. It's been able to take us again to another level. And so these concepts that we've been using for thousands of years, again, are somewhat hidden. This is one of those magical things that people weren't supposed to know. This was the magic of the universe. This was the finger of God that people speak of. And it's what's gotten us to where we are today. I'm going to read a statement by Galileo Galilei from 1564 to 1642. He's the guy that ended up making it to where the church finally, posthumously, agreed on what he had come up with eventually. For what he came up with is that we're not the center of the universe like you've been trying to tell us, just like you told us we're only 4,000 BC. The sun is at the center of our solar system, and that makes sense because it's huge. And the ancients even knew about the size of the sun. Even though to our eyes it looks the same as the moon, they knew the moon had a different ratio to it. And I'm going to show you a video coming up about that. Let me just finish off this one with this statement here and we'll get on with it. Philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze every night. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. You know, it would be like trying to read Sanskrit for you right now, or Japanese, if you didn't even understand the language of what it was written in. Well, this is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. So even Galileo knew this thing about sacred geometry and the way it all hooked up and where he'd come up with the ideas. People talk about what we lost from the Library of Alexandria and these other things. I think it's amazing enough of it was retained that enough people could latch back onto it and see. Now this has done great things for humanity, but also horrifying things like helped envelop or unload or unleash a nuclear atom upon people, which could be used to power our world easily right now. But due to the scare that's going on and don't want everybody to get a hold of that, because then they could have bomb material too, it's all hushed off, and then we've got these stupid things going on in the modern day. Well, weren't we already trying to do all of that? Yes, battery-powered cars, we were all trying to do solar power and things. This is things from whenever I was a kid. So whenever they try to act like we're coming on with new stuff, no, they're just pushing something that we already realize is 20, 30 years out if we get on our horse. And you're not making us get on our horse in any way that we weren't doing before. You're actually just making it seem impossible for the people that are looking at what it takes to make it happen. And then everybody realizes that, oh, this isn't going to happen the way that you thought, and you tried to push it on everybody, and that's just, it's sad to watch us go through that at this current time. If someone was to present it in a totally different way, and let's lean that way, you know, like JFK did when he said, we're fixing to go to the moon and back. That's one thing. When you turn around and people that are experts and start pushing things like climate change, it's being distorted, and all these other ideas, it kind of just taints you on the whole idea of y'all are just going silly about a lot of things. And then maybe that'll re-hone us into the idea of what's very important. And again, this sacred geometry concept is real important. If we ever have to defend this earth from anything coming in, we'll be using that. Yeah, if you're ever on a boat going anywhere, that's using that. But it's also used in everyday life, and in fact, it's entrapped in most everything around you right now. We'll get on with another part of this. This is just a layer trying to show you the idea of the story of creation, how if we took away the Bible's idea and really gave it its essence that found from pagans, people had this a long time ago. And there is a story of creation even written in sacred geometry. Let me know what you think down below. Peace.